Welcome, dear listeners, to a special episode of Radio 13, your go-to channel for serialized horror stories, airing every Sunday night at 8 p.m. To kick off our very first special episode, we're thrilled to present to you the spine-chilling detective series, Dark Hospital: The Seven Curses. Now sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. There are places in this world that, even when forgotten, leave a lingering darkness in the minds of those who once crossed their threshold. Shadow Ridge Hospital is one of those places. On a stormy night over 20 years ago, Shadow Ridge Hospital, tucked away in a dense forest on the outskirts of a small American town, suddenly shut its doors. There was no official explanation, no investigations, and the remaining patients inside vanished without a trace. The hospital's story was abruptly cut off, leaving only whispered rumors and ghostly tales about what was once a place of healing. The local residents, especially the older generation, still remember the strange sounds, the eerie cries that echoed from the hospital during the dead of night. They say the hospital was more than just a place for the sick. It was a gateway to something terrifying, hidden behind crumbling walls and a silence that suffocated. As time passed, the stories of Shadow Ridge Hospital were buried under layers of dust. The darkness never truly left. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. No one dared to go near the hospital anymore, except for the occasional thrill seeker or the truly desperate. It's said that those who enter either never return or come back shattered, their minds broken beyond repair. But for Jason, a young and ambitious journalist, Shadow Ridge Hospital isn't just a mystery to be solved, an opportunity to uncover the truth. With the help of Emily, an experienced paranormal investigator, and Dr. Carter, a seasoned physician who once worked at the hospital before its closure, Jason sets out to delve into the shadows and uncover what really happened on that fateful night. Some secrets demand to be revealed, and some sins must be paid for. But as Jason and his team venture deeper into the hospital, they have no idea that the curses long dormant are waiting for them. Their footsteps echo through empty corridors, and the faint beams of their flashlights barely cut through the thick, oppressive darkness. Every corner, every room, holds its own haunting presence, as if waiting for someone to return and finish what was started long ago. 7 curses, 7 sins, and 7 souls trapped in a cycle of vengeance and torment. None of the investigators realize that they are the final pieces of the puzzle, forced to confront the darkness within their own hearts. They hope to survive, break the terrifying cycle that has ensnared Shadow Ridge Hospital. Episode 1, The First Cursed Pride. Chapter 1, The Arrival. The sun was dipping below the horizon as Jason steered the car down the narrow, winding road leading to Shadow Ridge Hospital. Forest on either side grew denser, the trees twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the last rays of daylight. Shadows lengthened, creeping across the cracked asphalt, and the air seemed to grow colder with every mile they covered. Jason glanced in the rearview mirror at Emily, who was sitting in the back seat, flipping through her notes with the methodical precision that came with years of paranormal investigation. She looked up, catching his eye, and offered a small, reassuring smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with the same unease that Jason felt gnawing at the back of his mind. "Not far," Jason replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just a few more minutes." Beside him, Dr. Carter sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The old doctor had been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd started the drive, and Jason couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Dr. Carter had worked at Shadow Ridge before it closed, and though he rarely spoke of it, Jason knew the memories still haunted him. The hospital came into view suddenly, looming out of the darkness like a forgotten relic. The building was massive, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Broken windows stared out like vacant eyes, and the air around the hospital seemed to hum with a quiet malevolence. Jason parked the car, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment, staring up at the decaying structure. A shiver ran down Jason's spine as he took in the sight. It was one thing to research a place like this, but standing here, in its shadow, was something else entirely. "This is it," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the others or himself. Emily nodded, already gathering her equipment. "Let's get to work. We don't want to lose what little daylight we have left." They stepped out of the car, and the sound of gravel crunching underfoot was the only noise that broke the oppressive silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. And as they approached the entrance, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The main doors of the hospital were slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment before pushing them open, revealing a dark, yawning lobby beyond. The floor was littered with debris, shattered glass, fallen ceiling tiles, and remnants of old furniture scattered haphazardly across the room. Jason shone his flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the ceiling was a patchwork of exposed beams and dangling wires. The place was a shell of its former self, a hollow reminder of what it had once been. "This is where it all started," Dr. Carter said quietly, his voice echoing in the empty space. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room as if he was searching for something lost in the shadows. The hospital was beautiful once, a place of hope. That changed. Emily began setting up her equipment, carefully placing EMF detectors, digital recorders, and cameras around the lobby. Jason watched her work, grateful for her steady hands and calm demeanor. She had been doing this for years, and if she was nervous, she didn't show it. As Jason moved to help, something caught his eye. A stack of old patient records, yellowed and brittle with age, lay forgotten on a nearby desk. He picked up the top file, thumbing through the pages. The name on the file read Dr. Richard Morgan, and as Jason scanned the text, he realized it belonged to one of the hospital's most renowned surgeons. "Dr. Morgan," Jason muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I've read about him. He was supposed to be a genius, but there's not much information about what happened to him." Carter looked up sharply at the mention of the name. Richard Morgan was a brilliant man, but he was also difficult, obsessed with his work. He was convinced he could achieve surgical perfection, but his methods were unconventional, to say the least. Jason frowned, sensing there was more to the story, but before he could ask, Emily interrupted. "Everything's set," she said, standing up and brushing dust off her hands. "We're ready to start the preliminary sweep." Jason nodded, slipping the file into his bag for later. "Let's go." They moved deeper into the hospital, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The deeper they went, the more the hospital's former grandeur faded, placed by a sense of decay and neglect. The walls were streaked with mold, and the air grew colder with each step. As they reached the old operating wing, the temperature dropped sharply. Emily's EMF detector began to beep, the lights flickering erratically. Jason exchanged a glance with her, both of them knowing what it meant. There was something here, something that didn't want to be disturbed. "This is where it happened," Dr. Carter said, his voice low and filled with a sorrow Jason hadn't heard before. "This is where Richard Morgan's pride led him down a dark path. He believed he could control life and death, but in the end, the sentence hung in the air, unfinished, as if the hospital itself didn't want it to be spoken aloud. They paused at the entrance to the operating room, the door half open, revealing the darkness beyond. Jason felt his heart pound in his chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was why they had come, to uncover the truth behind the hospital's dark past, no matter the cost. "Are we ready?" Jason asked, his voice barely steady. Emily nodded, gripping her camera tightly. "Let's do this." Dr. Carter didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. He was ready to face whatever ghosts lingered in these halls, even if it meant confronting his own. With a deep breath, Jason pushed the door open, and the three of them stepped into the darkness, ready to uncover the secrets that Shadow Ridge Hospital had kept hidden for so long. Chapter 2: First Encounter. The last light of day had long since faded, leaving the hospital shrouded in darkness. A thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to press in on all sides, absorbing the weak beams of the team's flashlight. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Jason led the way, his heart pounding as they ventured deeper into the hospital's forgotten corridors. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper of wind through broken windows set his nerves on edge. Emily followed close behind, her EMF detector clutched tightly in one hand. Faint beeping of the device, the only sign that she, too, was on high alert. Dr. Carter brought up the rear, his face a mask of grim determination. "Let's start with the operating wing," Emily suggested, her voice hushed as if afraid to disturb the spirits that undoubtedly lingered here. "It's where the activity spiked earlier." Jason nodded, grateful for her steady presence. Emily was a seasoned investigator, and her experience was invaluable. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her voice, underlying fear that this place seemed to inspire in everyone who dared to enter. As they approached the operating room, the air grew noticeably colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, chilling you from the inside out. The lights on Emily's EMF detector flickered erratically, the beeping growing louder and more insistent. "There's definitely something here," she whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness. "It's strong." Jason felt a shiver run down his spine. He had researched haunted locations before, had even visited a few, but nothing had ever felt like that. There was a presence here, something that was watching them, waiting. They stopped in front of the operating room door, which hung slightly ajar as if beckoning them inside. Jason hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. A sense of dread washed over him, an almost overwhelming urge to turn back and leave this place behind. But he pushed it down, reminding himself why they were here, to uncover the truth, to find out what really happened at Shadow Ridge Hospital all those years ago. And to do that, they had to face whatever it was that still lingered in these darkened halls. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was vast, larger than Jason had expected, with high ceilings and walls lined with rusted surgical equipment. A large operating table stood in the center, draped with a tattered sheet that fluttered slightly as they entered, as if disturbed by an invisible hand. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. Emily moved forward cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the room. The beam caught on something in the corner, and she froze, her breath hitching in her throat. "Jason, over here." He followed her gaze, his own flashlight revealing the source of her alarm. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow, stood a figure. At first glance, it looked like a person. A tall man in a long white coat, his head bowed as if in prayer. But as Jason stepped closer, he realized with a jolt that the figure wasn't solid. It was translucent, the edges of its form wavering slightly, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. Jason's mouth went dry. "Is that Dr. Morgan?" Dr. Carter whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "It's him." The figure raised its head slowly, and Jason felt a cold wave of terror crash over him as he met the figure's eyes, empty, hollow sockets that seemed to bore into his very soul. There was no mistaking it. This was Dr. Richard Morgan, or what was left of him. Before Jason could react, the figure began to move, gliding across the room with unnatural speed. The air around them grew colder still, and Jason could feel a pressure building in his chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights on Emily's EMF detector went wild, flashing and beeping frantically. "Jason, get back," Emily shouted, but the words barely registered. He was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the ghostly figure as it approached. There was something in those empty eyes, something dark and malevolent, a warning, perhaps, or a threat. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Temperature in the room shot back up, the oppressive cold lifting as if a switch had been flipped. Jason stumbled back, gasping for air, his heart racing. What the hell was that? He managed to choke out, still reeling from the encounter. That was Dr. Morgan, Dr. Carter said, his voice shaking. Or at least, what's left of him. I've never seen anything like this before, not even when I worked here. Emily was already checking her equipment, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the data. I've got the EMF readings, but no visual. Cameras didn't pick up anything. Jason looked around the room, his mind racing. The figure had been so real, so tangible, and yet there was nothing left to prove it had been there at all. No trace, no sign, just the lingering feeling of dread. "We need to keep moving," Emily said, her voice firm but laced with fear. "Whatever that was, it's not the only thing in this hospital, and I don't think it wants us here." Dr. Carter nodded, his face pale. "We've disturbed something. Something that was better left alone." Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had come here for answers, but now he wasn't so sure he wanted to find them. Not if it meant facing whatever darkness lurked in the depths of Shadow Ridge Hospital. But it was too late to turn back. They had already crossed the threshold, and whatever awaited them in the shadows would have to be faced. "Let's go," Jason said, his voice steadying with determination. "We've got a job to do." They left the operating room, the door creaking shut behind them, and the hospital swallowed them up once more. But the sense of unease clung to them like a shroud, and as they ventured deeper into the heart of the hospital, they all knew that something had awakened, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. Chapter 3: Uncovering the Past. The halls of Shadow Ridge Hospital seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a labyrinth of decaying rooms and forgotten memories. Each step they took felt heavier, as if the hospital itself resisted their presence. Jason's mind buzzed with the lingering terror of their encounter in the operating room, but there was no time to dwell on fear. They had to keep moving. Dr. Morgan was a genius, Dr. Carter said suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. He was admired, even revered in medical circles, but that admiration, it was a double-edged sword. Jason glanced over at the old doctor. Dr. Carter's face was etched with worry lines, his eyes shadowed with a history he hadn't yet shared. There was something more, Jason realized, something deeply personal in the way Dr. Carter spoke of Dr. Morgan. "What do you mean?" Jason asked, his voice echoing softly down the corridor. Dr. Carter sighed, as if the weight of the past had finally become too heavy to bear alone. "Richard Morgan was my mentor. I was fresh out of medical school, eager to make a name for myself, and he took me under his wing. I thought I was lucky, but I didn't see it then. His obsession, his pride, consumed him." Emily, who had been scanning the surrounding area with her flashlight, turned her attention to Dr. Carter. "You said he was obsessed." "With what?" "With perfection," Dr. Carter replied, his voice tinged with regret. "He believed he could achieve surgical procedures that no one else could. He was determined to push the boundaries of medicine, to make Shadow Ridge a beacon of medical excellence, but he pushed too far." As they continued down the corridor, they came across a set of double doors labeled Records Archive. The doors were partially open, revealing rows of dusty filing cabinets and shelves cluttered with forgotten files. Jason's pulse quickened. If there was any place in the hospital that held the key to Dr. Morgan's downfall, it would be here. They stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering overhead light, casting long shadows across the rows of cabinet. Emily began rifling through the files, her fingers brushing over patient records, surgical notes, and old correspondence. "This place is a gold mine," she muttered, pulling out a stack of yellowed documents. "But we're looking for something specific, something that tells us what really happened to Dr. Morgan." Jason joined her, searching the cabinets for anything that stood out. His hands shook slightly as he pulled open a drawer marked Confidential. Inside, he found a thick file labeled Morgan Richard, Personal Correspondence and Notes. His heart skipped a beat. "Guys, I think I found something," Jason called out, holding up the file. Dr. Carter's eyes widened as he saw the label. "That's it. That's what we need." They gathered around a small, dust-covered table in the center of the room, Jason carefully opening the file. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, letters, and medical records, all in Dr. Morgan's meticulous script. As they sifted through the documents, a disturbing picture began to emerge. "Look at this," Emily said, holding up a page covered in dense medical jargon. "These are surgical notes." He was experimenting with a new procedure, something to do with the brain. But the way he describes it, it's almost like he's trying to play God. Jason read over her shoulder, the words sending a chill down his spine. Dr. Morgan had written about his frustration with conventional medicine, about how he believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change the world. But the notes became increasingly erratic, the handwriting more chaotic, as if his mind was unraveling. He started losing patience, Dr. Carter said quietly. his voice filled with sorrow. The more he tried to perfect his methods, the more mistakes he made. But he refused to accept failure. Couldn't see that his pride was leading him to ruin. Jason's hand brushed against a small, leather-bound journal at the bottom of the file. He opened it to the first page, revealing an inscription in Dr. Morgan's elegant handwriting. To my legacy, may it stand the test of time. The entries began with clinical precision, detailing Dr. Morgan's ambitions and the steps he was taking to achieve his goals. But as Jason flipped through the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. The entries became more personal, more desperate. They don't understand. One entry read, "They call me mad, but I see the truth. I am so close. I can feel it. If only they could see what I see, they would know that I am not insane. I am a pioneer." Emily shook her head as she read over Jason's shoulder. He was losing his grip on reality. His obsession blinded him to the damage he was doing. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the journal. "There's more," he said, turning to a later entry. "A patient, Mr. Avery, came to see me today. He spoke of divine retribution, warned me that I was defying the natural order. He's a fool. I am beyond such superstitions. But why do I feel this dread? Why do his words haunt me so?" "Mr. Avery," Jason repeated. He must have been someone important to Dr. Morgan. Maybe someone who tried to stop him. Dr. Carter's face paled as he read the final entry aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "I will prove them wrong. I will succeed where others have failed. Tomorrow I will perform the procedure on myself. It is the only way. I will show them all that I was right. I will achieve perfection, no matter the cost." Silence fell over the room as the weight of Dr. Morgan's words sank in. The journal fell from Dr. Carter's hand, landing on the table with a dull thud. The finality of it all was overwhelming. Dr. Morgan had been so consumed by his pride, so determined to prove his worth, that he had sacrificed everything, even his sanity. He performed the surgery on himself, Emily whispered, voice filled with horror. That's insane." Dr. Carter nodded, his expression grim. He believed it was the only way. But it wasn't just pride that drove him. It was fear. Fear that he wasn't good enough, that he would be forgotten. And in the end, that fear destroyed him. Jason felt a chill run through him, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Dr. Morgan's pride, his refusal to accept failure, had led him down a path of madness and self-destruction. And now, even in death, that pride had become a curse, wrapping his spirit within the walls of Shadow Ridge Hospital, doomed to relive his mistakes for eternity. "We need to be careful," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "If this is what pride did to Dr. Morgan, who knows what the other curses might be capable of?" Emily nodded, face set with determination. "We'll find out, but we have to stay focused. This isn't just about uncovering the past. It's about stopping these curses before they claim more lives." Dr. Carter said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was haunted by the knowledge that he had been a part of this, that he had watched Dr. Morgan's descent into madness and had done nothing to stop it. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and Jason could see that it was taking its toll. "We'll get through this," Jason said, placing a reassuring hand on Dr. Carter's shoulder. "Together." The old doctor nodded slowly, but the haunted look in his eyes remained. "I just hope we're not too late." With the journal in hand, they left the records archive, the heavy door creaking shut behind them. The darkness of the hospital seemed to close in around them as they ventured deeper into the heart of Shadow Ridge, the echoes of Dr. Morgan's pride and madness following them with every step. And as they moved through the shadows, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The hospital was watching them, waiting for them to uncover its darkest secret. But those secrets came at a price. The further they went, the more Jason feared that price would be too high. Chapter 4. The Warning. The oppressive silence of Shadow Ridge Hospital was broken only by the distant creaks and groans of the aging structure. As Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter made their way through the labyrinthine halls, the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The chilling knowledge of Dr. Morgan's tragic fate weighed on them. They had little time to dwell on it. There was still so much they didn't understand, and the deeper they ventured, the more unsettling their discoveries became. Having left the records archive, the team decided to investigate the upper floors. Dr. Carter mentioned that the administrative offices might hold more clues about the hospital's history and any additional information regarding Dr. Morgan's later years. They reached a dilapidated stairwell, the steps covered in a thick layer of dust. As they ascended, the sense of unease grew stronger. Emily's EMF detector continued to beep intermittently, indicating residual energy or disturbances in the area. The upper floors were in even worse condition than the rest of the hospital. Broken windows and collapsed ceilings that made navigation treacherous. The corridor was dimly lit by a few flickering emergency lights, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Jason's flashlight swept across the hallway, revealing a series of offices and conference rooms. They began searching through the rooms, hoping to find something that could explain the nature of the curses that plagued Shadow Ridge Hospital. In one office, Jason discovered a large, ornate desk buried under piles of old papers. As he cleared away the debris, he found a drawer that was surprisingly intact. Inside, he uncovered a collection of old medical journals and correspondence. Among them was a file labeled Patient Complaints and Legal Action. "This might be worth a look," Jason said, pulling out the file. Emily joined him, and they began sifting through the document. The file was filled with letters from former patients and their families, each one detailing complaints about the hospital's practices. Many of the complaints centered around Dr. Morgan's experimental procedures and the resulting complications. One letter in particular caught Emily's eye. It was written by a woman named Helen Avery, and it was dated shortly before the hospital's closure. The letter was desperate, pleading for justice and expressing fear for her husband, Mr. Avery, who had been a patient under Dr. Morgan's care. "Dr. Morgan has done something terrible," the letter read. "My husband's condition has worsened since the procedure, and I fear for his life. We've been told to keep quiet, but I can no longer stay silent. There is something wrong at Shadow Ridge Hospital, and I fear it is more than just poor medical practices. Please, someone needs to investigate before it's too late." Jason's stomach churned as he read the letter. The name Avery was familiar from the journal entries, and the sense of foreboding deepened. Dr. Carter had mentioned Mr. Avery in the context of Dr. Morgan's final descent into madness. Connection was becoming clearer, and it was unsettling. "That's the same Mr. Avery mentioned in the journal," Jason said, showing the letter to Dr. Carter. "It looks like Dr. Morgan's experiments had serious consequences." Dr. Carter's face grew ashen as he read the letter. Helen Avery was a brave woman. She tried to expose what was happening here, but no one listened. By the time the complaints were taken seriously, it was too late. As they continued to explore, Emily's EMF detector began to beep more urgently. She looked up, her expression troubled. "The readings are spiking again. Feels like we're being watched." Jason glanced around, a feeling of unease intensifying. They had uncovered disturbing evidence, and it seemed that the hospital itself was reacting to their presence. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably. They entered a large conference room that seemed untouched by the passage of time. A long, wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed chairs covered in dust. The walls were lined with faded photographs of hospital staff and various accolades the hospital had received over the years. Jason approached a large, framed certificate hanging on the wall. It was an award given to Dr. Morgan for outstanding contributions to medical science. The irony of the award, given the man's eventual downfall, was not lost on him. Suddenly, the door to the conference room slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing them all to jump. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the hallway, sending chills down their spines. "Get the door," Emily shouted, her voice trembling. She rushed to the door, but it was locked, the handle cold and unyielding. Jason and Dr. Carter joined her, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The wailing grew louder, more insistent, and the lights in the room flickered erratically. The oppressive sense of dread was overwhelming, and Jason could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "Something's trying to warn us," Dr. Carter said, his voice filled with panic. "We need to get out of here." Jason could barely hear him over the noise. The wail seemed to come from everywhere at once, a ghostly lament that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. Glanced around, searching for another way out. There was a small window on the far side of the room, partially obscured by a curtain. "Over there!" Jason shouted, pointing to the window. Emily grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the window, shattering the glass. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it a sense of relief. They climbed through the broken window, one by one, and into the open air. Once outside, they stumbled away from the building, gasping for breath. The night was clear and cold, the stars shining brightly above them. The oppressive weight of the hospital seemed to lift slightly as they distanced themselves from the cursed building. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice shaky as she looked back at the hospital. "That was a warning," Jason said, his voice firm despite his own fear. "We're not just dealing with ghosts. Whatever is here, it doesn't want us to uncover the truth." Dr. Carter nodded, his face pale. "The curses, they're not just stories. They're real, and they're powerful. We need to be careful." They stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation sinking in. The warnings they had received were only the beginning, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their investigation would become. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "We've come this far, and we can't turn back now. We need to understand what happened here and put an end to it. But we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Emily and Dr. Carter both nodded in agreement, their resolve strengthening despite the fear that gripped them. They had uncovered more of Shadow Ridge's dark past, and they knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger. With a final look at the imposing silhouette of the hospital, they turned and began to walk away, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The night was cold and unforgiving. They were determined to see their investigation through to the end. As they disappeared into the darkness, the wailing from the hospital faded into the distance. A haunting reminder of the curses that awaited them within the walls of Shadow Ridge. Chapter 5. Pride Comes Before a Fall. The next morning, the sun shone weakly through the haze of early morning fog, casting a pale light over Shadow Ridge Hospital. Despite the warmth of the day, an icy chill lingered in the air, a remnant of the terror they had faced the night before. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter reconvened outside the hospital, their faces drawn and weary from the previous night's events. "We need to regroup," Jason said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "We've learned a lot. We still have a long way to go. The curses are real, and they're tied to the sins of those who came before us." Emily nodded, her expression serious. "Dr. Morgan's pride was the first curse. We saw how destructive it was. We have to figure out what the other curses are and how to confront them." Dr. Carter looked troubled. The pride of Dr. Morgan was more than just arrogance. It consumed him and caused his downfall. It's clear that these curses are not just metaphors. They're powerful, malevolent forces that continue to influence the hospital. The team agreed to investigate further, starting with the administrative offices they had barely explored. There was a locked door at the end of the hall marked "Private, No Admittance." Dr. Carter had mentioned it might contain valuable information, and they hoped it would shed light on the other curses. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter made their way back into the hospital, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The oppressive atmosphere of Shadow Ridge seemed to grow thicker as they approached the locked door. It was as if the building itself was bracing for their intrusion. Jason tried the handle, but it was locked tight. Emily pulled out a small toolkit from her bag and began to work on the lock. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open and the door creaked ajar. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. It was well maintained, with a large mahogany desk, comfortable chairs, and shelves filled with neatly organized files. It was as if this room had been frozen in time, the last remnant of the hospital's former glory. Emily and Jason began to sift through the files, while Dr. Carter examined a large, ornate cabinet in the corner. It was filled with personal items, photographs, awards, and a few old journals. One of the journals caught Jason's eye. It was leather-bound, Dr. Morgan's name embossed on the cover. He opened it carefully, revealing neatly written entries detailing Dr. Morgan's final months. The entries were increasingly frantic, filled with paranoia and obsessive thoughts about the curses and the consequences of his action. I am being watched, one entry read. I can feel their eyes on me, judging me for my sins. I have to find a way to protect myself to escape this torment. I cannot fail now. Jason showed the journal to Emily and Dr. Carter. This is important. It looks like Dr. Morgan was aware of the curses and the malevolent forces at play, but he didn't know how to stop them. Dr. Carter's face was pale as he read the entries. He believed the curses were a punishment for his pride, but it seems he was wrong. The curses were more than just punishment. They were a part of the hospital's dark legacy. As they continued to search the room, Emily found a folder labeled Research on Curses. Inside, there were notes and sketches related to various supernatural phenomena. Among them was a detailed account of the 7 curses believed to be linked to the hospital's history. Each curse was associated with one of the 7 deadly sins. The document outlined possible manifestations and effect. Jason scanned the document, his eyes widening as he read about the curses. Pride, the belief that one is superior to others, leading to a fall from grace. Envy, the desire for what others have, causing torment and suffering. Wrath, uncontrolled anger that leads to violence and destruction. Sloth, laziness and inaction that results in decay and deterioration. Greed, an insatiable desire for wealth or possessions, leading to corruption. Gluttony, overindulgence and excess that brings ruin and downfall. Lust, an intense desire that drives one to madness. Each curse was described in detail, with notes on how they manifested in Shatteridge Hospital. The document also included warnings about the dangers of delving too deeply into the curses, suggesting that they could become more powerful and dangerous the more they were investigated. This is what we're dealing with, Jason said, his voice grim. The 7 curses are tied to the sins of the past. If we're going to stop them, we need to understand how they work and what we're up against. Dr. Carter nodded. The pride of Dr. Morgan was just the beginning. The other curses are just as powerful and dangerous. We need to be prepared. As they discussed their next steps, a sudden noise from the hallway interrupted them. The sound of footsteps and faint whispers echoed through the corridor, growing louder as if someone or something was approaching. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter exchanged worried glances. They had uncovered valuable information, but it seemed the hospital was not done with them yet. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to move and shift as if alive. Without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers turned into harsh, distorted voices that seemed to come from every direction. Cold, malevolent presence filled the room, making it hard to breathe. "Get out of here," Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. They scrambled to their feet, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way toward the door. The whispers and the cold grew more intense, as if the curses were reacting to their intrusion. Just as they reached the door, a gust of icy wind slammed it shut, trapping them inside. Jason pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The oppressive force in the room seemed to grow stronger, and the voices became more insistent. "We need to find another way out," Jason yelled, his voice echoing through the darkened room. Emily's flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving them in near total darkness. Jason fumbled for his phone, using its dim light to search for an exit. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, desperately looking for a way out. Dr. Carter, his face pale with fear, pointed to a small vent high on the wall. "We can try that. It might lead to another part of the hospital." Jason nodded, and they worked together to move a large filing cabinet beneath the vent. Emily climbed up first, squeezing through the narrow opening. She reached back to help the others, and they all managed to escape through the vent, emerging into a dark, dusty storage room. Panting and shaken, they looked back at the vent, relieved to have escaped the oppressive force. The whispers and cold had vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of dread. "That was too close," Jason said, his voice trembling. "We need to be more careful. The curses are reacting to us, and we're not safe here." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "We have the information we need. Now we have to use it to understand and confront the curses." Dr. Carter looked at them both, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "We've only scratched the surface. There's much more to uncover, and we have to be prepared for whatever comes next. With that, they left the storage room and made their way back to the hospital's main entrance. The oppressive darkness of Shadow Ridge Hospital seemed to close in around them as they prepared to face the next challenge in their investigation. The curses were more than just stories. They were real, and they were waiting. As they stepped out into the cold light of day, they knew that their journey was far from over. The path ahead was fraught with danger, and the sins of the past would not rest easily. But they were determined to see it through, to uncover the truth and end the curse that had plagued Shadow Ridge Hospital for so long. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The sun was now high in the sky, its light barely penetrating the thick clouds that hung over Shadow Ridge Hospital. As Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter emerged from the building, the cold, damp air felt oddly refreshing compared to the suffocating darkness they had just escaped. Their breaths were visible in the chill, and each step away from the hospital seemed to lighten the weight of dread that had settled on their shoulders. The storage room they had escaped into was a small reprieve, but it had only served as a temporary escape from the malevolent presence within the hospital. Now, back outside, the reality of their situation set in. The team was exhausted and shaken, but they knew they couldn't afford to rest just yet. As they walked towards their temporary camp near the hospital's entrance, the tension was palpable. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice soft but resolute. "We need to debrief and figure out our next steps. We can't just leave things like this." Dr. Carter nodded in agreement. "We have the information from the research files, but we still need to understand how to break the curses. Each curse seems to be more powerful than the last, and we have to be prepared for whatever comes next." Jason looked over at his companion, a mixture of concern and determination in his eyes. "We need to take a moment to regroup. Let's go over everything we found and come up with a plan. We can't let fear paralyze us. We need to act." The trio set up a makeshift camp in the parking lot, using their supplies to create a temporary base. As they settled down, Jason spread out the documents they had gathered, including Dr. Morgan's journal, folder on the 7 curses, and various notes. "We've learned a lot," Jason said, reviewing the notes. Dr. Morgan's pride was the first curse. The documents indicate that the other curses are just as powerful and are tied to the 7 deadly sins. We need to identify how each curse manifests and find a way to neutralize them. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the notes. The next curse is envy. According to the document, causes torment and suffering. We should look into any historical cases of patients who might have exhibited signs of envy or jealousy. Dr. Carter added, "The hospital has a long history of patient complaints and legal actions. We need to dig deeper into those records to see if there are any connections. The curses are linked to the sins of the past, so we might find clues in the histories of former patients." As they worked, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. They looked up to see a group of local officials and reporters who had come to investigate the site following recent media coverage of their investigation. The officials, led by a stern-faced man in a suit, approached cautiously. "We've heard about the disturbances here and came to see what's going on. We need to ensure that there are no safety hazards for the public." Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter exchanged glances. They had to be careful about what they revealed. "We're conducting a historical investigation," Jason said, trying to sound as composed as possible. "We found some unsettling information about the hospital's past. We're trying to understand it before making any further decisions." The official looked at them skeptically but seemed satisfied with the explanation. "Keep us informed of any findings, and please be cautious. This place is more dangerous than it seems." As the officials and reporters left, Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter resumed their work. The interruption had momentarily distracted them, but the urgency of their mission remained. In the hours that followed, they carefully examined the patient records and historical documents. They discovered a disturbing pattern. Several patients had suffered severe psychological distress and physical ailments that seemed to align with the symptoms described for the curses. Emily found a particular case file that stood out, a patient named Lucas Bennett, who had experienced extreme paranoia and delusions, eventually leading to his tragic death. His case was marked by a series of complaints about envy and dissatisfaction with his treatment, which seemed to align with the curse of envy described in the document. "This case is significant," Emily said, showing the file to Jason and Dr. Carter. "Lucas Bennett's symptoms fit the description of the curse of envy. We need to investigate further to see if there are any remaining clues about how this curse manifested." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, the team felt a renewed sense of urgency. They had uncovered valuable information, but the dangers they faced were far from over. The curse of pride had been only the beginning, and the curse of envy was their next challenge. Dr. Carter, visibly tired, spoke up. "We faced one curse, and now we need to confront the next. But we must proceed with caution. Curses are growing stronger, and our investigation is becoming increasingly dangerous." Jason nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We need to be prepared for anything. The curses are not just supernatural, they're tied to real human experiences and emotion. We need to understand their origins and find a way to break their hold on this place." Emily packed up the documents, her mind racing with possibilities. "We need to go back into the hospital, but we have to be careful. Curses are powerful, and we have to be ready for whatever comes next." As darkness fell over Shadow Ridge Hospital, the team gathered their supplies and prepared to return to the hospital. The night was eerily quiet, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow thicker as they approached the building once more. With a final glance at the hospital's imposing silhouette, Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter steeled themselves for the challenges ahead. Curses were real and dangerous, and they had to face them head-on to uncover the truth and bring an end to the suffering that had plagued Shadow Ridge Hospital so long. The journey was far from over, and the darkness of the hospital awaited them. They knew that their next steps would be critical in their quest to understand and overcome the curses that had defined the hospital's tragic history. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes episode 1 of Shadow Ridge Hospital, The 7 Curses. Thank you all for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed the journey so far. Be sure to join us next Sunday at 8 p.m. for episode 2, The Second Curse. Read. Until then, stay safe and keep the lights on.